Okay guys, so this video is going to look at initial planning considerations for the critical question, what are the planning considerations for improving performance? Now our syllabus here asks us to learn about initial planning considerations which include the performance and fitness needs, including individual and team needs. We need to have a look at the schedule of events and competitions that might be coming up. And we also have to think about the climate and the season of the competition. Your Learn To that goes along with this Learn About asks you to describe the specific considerations of planning for performance in events and competitions, and how would this planning differ for elite athletes and recreational/amateur participants. Okay, so essentially as we go through, I'm going to try and differentiate as we go between amateur athletes and elite athletes. Now let's start with performance and fitness needs. Now of course this is broken up into team and individual sections. In the team section, we're looking at the general fitness that's required for the sport. So that's just general things for the whole team. So for rugby league, for example, everyone needs to have some cardiovascular fitness. Everyone needs to have some muscular endurance. But your forwards need to have a lot more strength and size and power compared to your backs, who need to make sure they've got more speed and agility. We're also going to look at strategy and tactics with our team as we think about our planning. What are our strategies? What are our tactics that we're going to be using throughout the season or for the upcoming competitions? And then also there's the general skills that are needed for the sport. So for AFL, for example, everyone needs to be able to catch and mark a ball, to be able to kick a ball, to be able to hand punt a ball. Those kinds of skills need to be looked at as well. When it comes to the individual, we're looking at where the individual starts and where we want to get them to. So each individual that comes into any kind of team, or even if it's an individual sport, they have their starting base levels of fitness, and then we need to work them and develop them up to where they need to be for their specific type of performance. We need to think about what their goals are as an individual, and we also need to think about their position and their team role. So like I mentioned before with the rugby league, your fullback has a different position and therefore has different requirements compared to your forward. And then of course there's specific skills. So in rugby league, there's a specific person or persons, sometimes there's a couple of them, who do the kicking, whether that be the kicking for goal or whether that be the on-field kicking. Different people take different roles with that, and so they need to practice the skills that they are required to do. So now when we compare our amateur and our elite athlete, our amateur player has lower fitness needs. Okay, they're not going to break down their sport as detailed as an elite athlete might. They also have lower skill levels, so they're not going to have the same goals as an elite athlete in terms of developing their skills and refining that as much. They'll still want to develop them, but not to the same level as an elite athlete. They're also going to have some slightly different goals. So they might have some social goals rather than an emphasis on winning and making sure that they are achieving their best. They might just be sitting there and looking at going and hanging out with their mates while they're participating in sport and enjoying life. When we now look at the schedule of events and competitions, the first thing in a schedule are the events. Okay, so whenever you're looking at creating a big periodization chart and you're looking to schedule in anything into the diary, the first thing that goes in are the major events. So if that's tennis, all the big major trophies are going to go into your schedule first, and then the minor ones go in after that. If you are playing in the English Premier League or in the NRL, your weekly competitions and when your games are, whether it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday or Monday, are going to go in there. Whether you have other games that might pop up like the State of Origin that might happen midweek and we might be losing some players around that, you're going to put all of those major events into your schedule and make sure that you then are adjusting your plans accordingly. Now, of course, some of these events can be seasonal, so like rugby league or soccer, they're often seasonal, netball seasonal, where you have a whole roughly 6 months where you're going to have weekly competitions. And then sometimes that's going to, in elite level, that's going to be even more than weekly. But we're also going to have other different types of competitions such as tennis, where your competitions tend to get clustered together. So your major trophies, so like the Australian Open, when you plan for that, there's going to be the Brisbane International, there's the Sydney International, there's the Hopman Cup over in Perth, and so athletes will often choose to use one of those in preparation for the Australian Open. They'll have a series of events within that competition, and they need to make sure that they prepare for each of those, particularly if there's someone who expects to be getting through to the semi-finals and final. They need to make sure that they're peaking at the right time and all those types of things, so that schedule is slightly different according to your sport. And of course, there's even other sports that have things even further spread out, such as athletics, where you might have the big goals of your Olympics and your Commonwealth Games or something, but really they're going to come around every 2 years. So the Commonwealth Games, it comes every 4 years, and your Olympics comes every 4 years, but they're normally around 2 years apart in the way that when they're performed. So your schedule of events and your competitions are then used by your coaches, your trainers and stuff to work out when you want to make sure that your athlete is peaking. So you want to make sure that your athlete who is expected to get to the semi-finals is peaking at the semi-finals. You want to make sure that if you're not expecting to get there, you probably want to peak a bit earlier so that you can actually get through the first couple of rounds to improve your overall ranking. But you're essentially looking at how you're going to schedule your training to make sure that your athlete peaks at the competitions that are where they need to peak. So I know, for example, in the World Cup, often Brazil would do really low level games before the World Cup, and they use their group stage really as their warm up normally to make sure that they're all ready for their then round of 16, quarterfinals, semi-finals, and final, because they always expect to be making it through to the final. We also have different lengths of phases, which are determined by the schedule of competitions. So in tennis, for example, you're going to have an in-season phase, which is a lot shorter due to those little clusters, and then you're going to have a big break, and then another in-season phase, and then another big break. Whereas that's very different to something like rugby league or soccer, where you're going to have a larger off-season and a really big in-season. Now, scheduling your events and competitions is really important for making sure that your athlete recovers properly from training, and so that you can adjust your volumes and intensities of training, which of course relates to peaking, but also is about making sure that you just look after your athlete and avoid injuries in general. When we compare our amateur and our elite athlete, our amateur athlete has a lot less competitions and events. So if you think of tennis, they're going to have an actual in-season during summer and then a long off-season. And whereas if they were more of an elite athlete, they'd have multiple in-seasons throughout the year. Or if you think of someone who might play in the EPL, for example, they would be playing in their weekly competitions, but let's say they also play in the Europa or the Champions League as well. That's going to add in quite a few extra games for them during that time. They're also going to have the FA Cup that they have to worry about as well. So they're going to have multiple games within their multiple different competitions that are overlapping, compared to their local person who's playing at their local club, who only has to worry about their weekly competition, which is always on the same day, pretty much at the same time every week. And therefore they don't have the same kind of preparation and worry about it. They're also going to have less travel. So our amateur athlete has less long distance travel, so they have to worry about that within their training. So for example, in the NRL, if you have to play against North Queensland up at Townsville, and then the next week you go down to Melbourne and play, you need to make sure that you put that into your schedule, because you're going to allow for that travel time. There's going to be less strategy for specific oppositions as well. So we're not going to be thinking about how we're going to approach a particular team as much. You might still do that, but not to the same kind of detail that your elite athletes are going to be doing. Even the same on strategy and on tactics. Your tactics are not going to be as well developed as your elite athletes. And of course, there's going to be less emphasis on winning, which will also affect all those different events and competitions. If you're not planning necessarily on winning those competitions, you're just planning to go and have fun, then that's not going to affect your training anywhere near as much as for the elite athlete who's out there to win, and they need to make sure that they're really peaking at the right time. We now shift to climate and seasons. So some sports have seasons, like I've mentioned. So football and netball, even tennis at the local level, have seasons where they are played, tennis during summer, football, netball normally during winter. So we have these seasonal sports, and athletes may have to travel as well. And so those seasons then should dictate what they do in terms of their training. So if you're meant to be playing in winter, then you should train during cold conditions. You should expect it to be wet. Whereas if you're playing cricket during summer and grounds and fields tend to be closed or cancelled when it rains, then you shouldn't be worried about training in the rain. You should just cancel your training or find an indoor venue. Athletes may also have to travel to other climates. So if you think about our tennis player, they've just played in the Australian Open, but then they're going to go over and play in the US Open. They might play in the French Open, and then they also have Wimbledon. And so you're really looking at some really major competitions that have a lot of travel and different climates involved in them. The same thing will happen for anyone who plays at an international level where they have to travel. So we have to think about that travel in terms of the heat and the type of season and stuff. We also have to think about the travel in terms of altitude. So are we now going to a particular city that's at higher altitude, which means I've got to adjust my training and do some altitude training to make sure that I'm going to be performing at my best when I get to that city. It might be hot, it might be cold. We need to make sure that we're actually adjusting and acclimatizing for the climate that we're going to. And so specific training will really benefit. Now, when we think about our amateur and our elite athlete in that, your amateur athlete is not doing anywhere near the same kind of travel, and therefore they have to worry about different climates. It's normally their local climate that they're going to be playing in. Often they're playing in just season blocks, and they'll have to think about the different travels. They have to think about altitudes and stuff. And then if they do go to somewhere that's at a different altitude, they're not normally going to think about doing some altitude training and stuff. It's very expensive. Whereas our elite athlete, they have to make sure that they cater and do all that specific training to make sure that they acclimatise to the new climate for where they're traveling to. Some other overall kind of comparisons between our elite and our amateur athlete. Elite athletes have a lot more resources, they have better facilities, they tend to use professionals in their training, whereas your amateur or your recreational athlete will tend to just use the local park or the local courts and have, maybe a friend who's coaching or a parent who's coaching them. The frequency of competition or events is also very different. So at your amateur level, normally weekly, whereas at your elite level, they're going to happen in basketball, they're every second day. So we're really looking at some very big differences in how frequent the games are, how intense the games are. We're also going to have very big differences in terms of how often you're going to be training. So if you're playing with your bunch of mates at the park on the weekends, you may not even go to training, that may not exist. Whereas if you're at elite level, you've got to go show up to training every day, sometimes twice a day, and they'll have specific things for you to do. They'll have sessions where you're working with a team. They might even talk about your nutrition, your recovery strategies, all that kind of stuff, which you're not doing at the amateur level. There's going to be differences in the intensity of the training and how much time you need to allow for recover. How long the training goes for will be different, and even the types of training that are used and the methods of training that are used are going to be different, because your amateur is not going to utilize as wide a variety or a specific method as will be used for the elite athlete.